November 1944. The Solomon Islands. Sergeant Jack Morrison had seen a lot of things in this war that didn't make sense, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what he was about to witness in the depths of that jungle. And if you think you know where this story is going, I promise you, you don't. Because what happened next would haunt every man in that patrol for the rest of their lives. The morning started like any other morning in hell. Morrison and his 6-man patrol had been trudging through the thick jungle for 3 days, hunting for a Japanese radio position that intelligence swore was somewhere in this sector. The humidity was so thick you could practically chew it. Every breath felt like drowning. Private Danny Chen was on point, machete in hand, hacking through vines that seemed to grow back the moment you cut them. Behind him, Corporal Mike Stevens struggled with the radio pack, cursing under his breath with every step. Then there was young Tommy Fletcher, barely 19, who'd only been in the Pacific Theater for 6 weeks. The kid still had that look in his eyes like he thought they were on some grand adventure. Morrison knew better. This wasn't adventure. This was survival. But the most important member of their patrol wasn't even human. Duke was a Belgian Malinois, a war dog trained for scouting and detection, and he'd saved their lives more times than Morrison could count. The dog had this sixth sense about danger, always knew when something wasn't right before any of the men did. Duke had been with Morrison since basic training in California, and there wasn't a man in the unit who didn't trust that dog more than their own instincts. Right now, Duke was walking beside Morrison, ears up, alert but calm. That was about to change. It was Chen who stopped first. He held up his fist, the signal for everyone to freeze. Morrison felt his heart rate spike, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. They all listened. The jungle had gone quiet. Anyone who'd spent time in the Pacific knew that when the jungle went quiet, something was wrong. The constant buzz of insects, the chatter of birds, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, it all just stopped. Like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. Duke's ears went flat against his head. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Chen pointed ahead with his machete, and Morrison moved up to see what had spooked him. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. There was something massive blocking the game trail they'd been following, something that didn't belong in any jungle Morrison had ever heard of. It took his brain a moment to process it, to accept what his eyes were telling him. It was a snake. But calling it a snake was like calling the ocean a puddle. The thing was coiled in the middle of the trail, and even coiled, it was as tall as a man's waist. Morrison had seen pythons before, seen some big ones in the Philippines, but this was different. This was impossible. The snake's body was as thick as a barrel, covered in scales that seemed to shift colors in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Dark green, almost black, with patterns that looked like shadows themselves. But it was the size that made Morrison's mouth go dry. He'd heard stories from the natives, tales about giant serpents that lived in the deepest parts of the jungle, snakes that could swallow a man whole. He'd always figured those were just stories, the kind of legends that grew in the telling. Looking at this thing now, he wasn't so sure anymore. Stevens whispered something that might have been a prayer. Fletcher had gone pale, his rifle shaking in his hands. The snake's head was resting on its coils, and Morrison could see one massive eye, unblinking, watching them. He'd read somewhere that snakes could sense heat, could see the warmth of living things even in darkness. This thing knew they were there. It had known the whole time. Duke's growl grew louder, more intense, but the dog didn't move forward. He stayed pressed against Morrison's leg, every muscle in his body tense. Morrison made a decision. He signaled for the patrol to back up slowly, to give the snake a wide berth. They could go around it. Find another route. No need to provoke something that could probably kill them all before they got off a decent shot. The men started to move, carefully, quietly, stepping backward in the same prints they'd made coming in. Duke backed up with them, still growling, still watching the snake. And that's when everything went wrong. Young Fletcher, nervous and inexperienced, stepped on a branch. The crack echoed through the silent jungle like a gunshot. The snake's head snapped up, and Morrison saw its eyes lock onto them with an intelligence that made his blood run cold. This wasn't the blank stare of a dumb animal. This thing was thinking. The snake began to uncoil, and as it did, Morrison realized with growing horror just how big it really was. 20 feet. 25. 30. The thing just kept coming, rising up, its head now level with Morrison's chest. Its mouth opened slightly, and he could see fangs the size of his fingers. Duke lost it. The dog launched himself forward with a bark that sounded more like a battle cry, putting himself between the snake and the patrol. Morrison screamed for Duke to come back, but the dog ignored him. The snake struck, fast as lightning, its head shooting forward. Duke dodged, barely, his training kicking in. But this wasn't like dodging a Japanese soldier. This was something else entirely. The snake struck again, and again Duke dodged, dancing around the massive serpent, barking and snarling, keeping its attention focused on him instead of the men. Morrison raised his rifle, trying to get a clear shot, but Duke was moving too fast, and the last thing he wanted to do was hit his own dog. The other men had their weapons up too, but nobody was firing. They all knew the same thing. You shoot at something that big, you better kill it fast, or you just make it angry. And an angry snake that size? That was a death sentence for all of them. Duke kept circling, kept the snake's attention, and Morrison saw what the dog was doing. Duke was giving them a chance to run. The dog was sacrificing himself for the patrol. But Morrison wasn't about to let that happen. He'd lost too many friends in this war, seen too many good men die in this miserable jungle. He wasn't going to lose Duke too. Not like this. He started moving to the side, trying to get an angle on the snake's head. If he could get a clean shot at the brain, or whatever passed for a brain in something that big, maybe they could end this. Stevens saw what Morrison was doing and moved the other way, creating a crossfire. Chen started yelling, trying to distract the snake, waving his machete over his head like a maniac. The snake seemed confused now, its head swiveling between Duke and the shouting men. Duke took advantage of the distraction and lunged in, biting at the snake's tail. His teeth couldn't penetrate those thick scales, but it got the snake's attention. The massive serpent whipped around, and its tail caught Duke in the ribs, sending the dog flying through the air. Duke hit a tree with a sickening thud and dropped to the ground, not moving. Morrison felt something break inside him. Something beyond fear, beyond rational thought. He stepped forward and fired 3 shots directly into the snake's open mouth. The shots echoed through the jungle like thunder. The snake reared back, thrashing, its body convulsing. Stevens opened fire too, then Chen, then Fletcher. The sound was deafening. Bullets tore into the snake's body, but the thing wouldn't go down. It thrashed and coiled, smashing into trees, tearing up the undergrowth. Blood, dark and thick, poured from dozens of wounds, but still it kept moving. Morrison kept firing until his magazine was empty, then slammed in another one and kept going. He was screaming now, screaming at the snake, at the jungle, at the war, at everything. And finally, the snake's movements began to slow. It coiled in on itself one last time, shuddered, and went still. The silence that followed was absolute. Morrison's ears were ringing from the gunfire, but beneath that, he could hear his own ragged breathing, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran to where Duke had fallen. The dog was lying on his side, breathing shallow, blood trickling from his mouth. Morrison dropped to his knees beside him, hands shaking as he checked for injuries. Broken ribs. Definitely. Maybe internal bleeding. Duke's eyes opened, found Morrison's face, and the dog's tail gave a weak thump against the ground. Morrison felt tears running down his face, mixing with the sweat and grime. Stevens was beside him now, the medic kit already open. They worked on Duke for 20 minutes, doing everything they could with their limited supplies. Wrapped his ribs, gave him water, tried to make him comfortable. The dog drifted in and out of consciousness, but he was alive. That was something. That was everything. Morrison sat back, exhausted, and looked at the dead snake. In death, it looked even bigger, its body stretched out across the trail, disappearing into the undergrowth on both sides. Chen was standing over it, machete still in hand, staring at the thing like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Fletcher was being sick in the bushes. Stevens was on the radio, trying to reach command, trying to explain what had just happened. Morrison knew how that conversation would go. Command would think they'd lost their minds. Heat stroke. Jungle fever. Battle fatigue. Nobody would believe them. Hell, Morrison wasn't sure he believed it himself, and he'd just lived through it. He reached down and ran his hand over Duke's head, feeling the dog's shallow breathing. Duke had saved them. Plain and simple. That dog had put himself between the patrol and certain death, had bought them the time they needed to fight back. But that wasn't even the strangest part of this story. Because what happened next, what they discovered about that snake, would turn everything they thought they knew upside down. And if you stick with me, you're going to hear about something that the military tried to bury for decades, something that didn't come to light until Morrison was an old man, sitting in a veterans hospital, finally ready to tell the truth about what happened in that jungle. Stevens finally got through to command. Morrison could hear him trying to explain the situation, his voice getting more frustrated with every word. No, it wasn't an alligator. No, it wasn't a crocodile. Yes, he knew how big snakes could get. No, this was bigger. He kept saying it was bigger. Finally, he just gave their coordinates and told them to send a truck. They had wounded, both human and canine, that needed to get back to base. Command agreed to extraction, probably just to shut Stevens up. While they waited, Chen did something that Morrison would never forget. He took out his knife and cut off a section of the snake's skin, a piece about the size of a man's hand. He wrapped it carefully in his rain poncho and tucked it into his pack. Morrison asked him what he was doing. Chen just looked at him and said, "Nobody's going to believe us. We need proof." He was right, of course. Morrison wished he'd thought of it first. They measured the snake while they waited, using a rope from Stevens' pack. 37 feet from head to tail. Girth at its widest point, nearly 3 feet around. They took photographs with Fletcher's camera, the one he'd been using to take pictures to send home to his mother. The snake looked even more impossible on film. Duke regained consciousness while they waited. The dog tried to stand, whimpered, and lay back down. Morrison gave him more water, spoke to him softly, told him he was a good dog, the best dog, that he was going to be okay. Duke's tail thumped again, weaker this time. Morrison had seen enough wounded men to know that look. Duke was in bad shape. The truck arrived 2 hours later, and Morrison had never been so happy to see anything in his entire life. The driver, a young private named Kowalski, took one look at the dead snake and his jaw dropped. He walked up to it, reached out like he wanted to touch it, then pulled his hand back like he'd changed his mind. They loaded Duke into the truck first, making him as comfortable as they could in the back. Then they tried to figure out what to do about the snake. There was no way they could transport the whole thing. It was too big, too heavy. In the end, they took more photographs, more measurements, and Chen cut off the head. It took him 15 minutes of hacking with his machete to sever the spine. The head alone was the size of a football, fangs and all. They wrapped it in canvas and loaded it into the truck with everything else. The drive back to base was bumpy and miserable. Morrison rode in the back with Duke, keeping pressure on the dog's bandages, talking to him constantly. Duke's breathing was getting shallower. His eyes were glazed. Morrison found himself praying, making deals with a god he wasn't even sure he believed in anymore. Take me instead. Let the dog live. He's innocent in all this. He didn't ask for this war. Fletcher sat across from him, still pale, still shaken. The kid kept looking at the canvas-wrapped snake head like it might come back to life. They arrived at base just as the sun was setting. The medics rushed Duke to the veterinary station, and Morrison tried to follow, but a lieutenant colonel he'd never seen before stopped him. The man was clean, pressed uniform, the kind of officer who spent the war behind a desk. He wanted to know what happened. Morrison told him. The officer didn't believe a word of it. He kept interrupting, kept asking if Morrison was sure they hadn't encountered a Japanese patrol, if maybe they'd been exposed to some kind of gas, if they were absolutely certain about what they'd seen. Morrison snapped. He grabbed the officer by his collar and dragged him to the truck, practically threw him into the back, and pointed at the snake head. The officer went white. He stepped back, nearly fell out of the truck, and just stood there staring. Then he said something that Morrison would never forget. He said, "You didn't see anything. None of this happened. Is that clear?" Morrison asked him what he was talking about. The officer repeated himself, more forcefully this time. "This didn't happen. That's an order, Sergeant. You and your men are to report that you encountered a large python, nothing unusual, and that's the end of it." Morrison couldn't believe what he was hearing. He just lost nearly an entire magazine of ammunition killing something that by all rights shouldn't exist. His dog was dying, and this desk jockey was trying to tell him it didn't happen? He started to argue, but the officer cut him off. There are things in this war that don't make it into official reports, Sergeant. Things that would cause panic, confusion, problems we don't need. This is one of those things. You follow your orders, you keep your mouth shut, and everybody goes home happy. You start talking about giant monsters in the jungle, and people start asking questions. Questions lead to investigations. Investigations lead to problems. You want problems, Sergeant. Morrison didn't want problems. He wanted to check on his dog. He saluted, said yes, sir, and walked away. He found the veterinary station, a small tent near the motor pool. Duke was on a table, and the vet, a tired-looking captain named Reynolds, was working on him. Reynolds looked up when Morrison came in and shook his head. Morrison felt his heart stop. Reynolds said the damage was too extensive. Internal bleeding, punctured lung, shattered ribs. He'd done everything he could, but Duke wasn't going to make it through the night. Morrison asked if the dog was in pain. Reynolds said he'd given him enough morphine to keep him comfortable. Morrison pulled up a chair and sat beside the table. He put his hand on Duke's head, felt the dog's breath, weak and ragged, against his palm. He stayed there all night, talking to Duke, telling him stories about home, about the beaches in California where they'd trained, about the girl Morrison had waiting for him back in Chicago who'd never met Duke but who'd love him if she ever got the chance. Duke died just before dawn. Morrison felt the moment it happened, felt the dog's breathing stop, felt the life leave him. He sat there for another hour, just sitting with his friend, unable to let go. They buried Duke that morning, in a clearing near the base. Morrison, Stevens, Chen, and Fletcher stood around the grave while Reynolds said a few words. It wasn't much of a ceremony, but it was something. They marked the grave with a wooden cross, and Morrison carved Duke's name into it with his knife. The rest of the day passed in a blur. They were debriefed by the same lieutenant colonel, who made them all sign papers saying they'd keep quiet about what they'd seen. The official report said they'd encountered a large python, approximately 15 feet long, and had dispatched it without incident. Duke's death was listed as combat-related, injury sustained in action. The truth was classified. And that should have been the end of it. Morrison and his men should have gone back to the war, finished their tours, and gone home with one more horrible memory among so many others. But it wasn't the end. Not even close. Because 3 days later, something happened that would change everything. Something that would make Morrison realize that the snake wasn't just an anomaly, wasn't just some freak of nature that they'd been unlucky enough to stumble across. Something that would make him understand that what they'd encountered in that jungle was part of something much, much bigger. It started with the bodies. A patrol went missing, 5 men, experienced soldiers who knew the jungle. They disappeared without a trace, no radio contact, nothing. Search teams found them 2 days later, or what was left of them. Morrison wasn't on the search team, but he heard the stories. The men had been crushed, bones shattered, bodies broken. And there were scale marks on their skin, huge scales, pressed into their flesh like someone had taken a stamp to them. The official report said it was a Japanese ambush, but Morrison knew better. He'd seen those scale patterns before. More patrols went missing over the next 2 weeks. More bodies turned up, all with the same injuries, all with the same scale marks. The camp was on edge, soldiers jumping at shadows, afraid to go out on patrol. Command tried to keep a lid on it, tried to maintain discipline, but fear spreads faster than orders in a place like that. And then one night, Morrison was awakened by screaming. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside, and what he saw made him question everything he thought he knew about reality. There were snakes in the camp. Not one, not 2, but dozens of them. Massive serpents, some even bigger than the one Morrison had killed, slithering between the tents, wrapping around soldiers, dragging them into the darkness. The whole camp erupted into chaos. Men were firing in every direction, explosions from grenades lit up the night, and through it all, Morrison could hear the hissing, a sound like steam escaping from a boiler, but louder, so much louder. He fired at the nearest snake, saw his bullets hit home, saw blood spray, but the thing kept coming. Stevens was beside him, emptying his magazine into another snake. Chen was on top of a supply truck, firing down at the creatures, screaming at the top of his lungs. Fletcher was nowhere to be seen. Morrison fought his way toward the command tent, toward where he knew they kept the heavier weapons. If bullets weren't stopping these things, maybe something bigger would. He made it inside, found a flamethrower, strapped it on, and headed back out. The heat was intense as he pulled the trigger, a stream of fire erupting from the nozzle, catching the nearest snake full in the face. The snake reared back, thrashing, its body engulfed in flames. The smell was horrific, burning meat and something else, something chemical that made Morrison's eyes water. But it worked. The snake collapsed, still burning, and Morrison moved on to the next one. Other soldiers saw what he was doing and grabbed flamethrowers too. The camp turned into an inferno, fire everywhere, the smoke so thick you could barely see. And slowly, the snakes began to retreat. They slithered back into the jungle, back into the darkness, leaving behind death and destruction. When dawn came, Morrison surveyed the damage. 37 men dead. Another 20 injured. 4 tents completely destroyed. And bodies of 8 snakes, massive creatures that by all rights shouldn't exist, lying burnt and broken around the camp. The lieutenant colonel was dead, crushed by one of the larger snakes. The new commanding officer, a major named Patterson, stood in the center of camp, looking shell-shocked. He called for Morrison, Stevens, and Chen. Fletcher had been found hiding in a supply closet, catatonic, completely broken. Patterson wanted to know what the hell was going on. Morrison told him everything. About the first snake, about Duke, about the cover-up, about the missing patrols. Patterson listened without interrupting, and when Morrison finished, the major was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We need to fall back. This position isn't defensible against whatever these things are. I'm evacuating the entire camp." And that's exactly what they did. Within 6 hours, the entire base was packed up and moved to a different location, 20 miles to the north, in an area that was more open, less jungle. But the snakes followed them. Or maybe there were snakes everywhere in this part of the Solomon Islands, and they'd just been lucky not to encounter them before. Either way, attacks continued. Smaller ones, usually at night, usually picking off stragglers or isolated patrols. The soldiers started calling them dragon snakes, and the name stuck. Command tried everything. They bombed sections of the jungle. They set up perimeter defenses with fire and explosives. They even tried poison, dumping barrels of chemicals into the water sources, hoping to kill the snakes that way. Nothing worked. The snakes were too smart, too adaptive. They learned to avoid the defenses, learned to attack only when they had the advantage. And Morrison realized something terrifying. These things were coordinating. They were hunting in packs, using tactics, working together. That wasn't normal snake behavior. That was something else. That suggested intelligence, real intelligence, not just animal cunning. 3 months after that first encounter, Morrison was rotated out. His tour was over, and he was going home. He said goodbye to Stevens and Chen, promised to keep in touch, and boarded the transport ship with Fletcher, who still hadn't spoken a word since the night of the attack. The voyage home was long and strange. Morrison kept having nightmares about the snakes, about Duke, about all the men who'd died. And he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something unfinished, that the story wasn't over. He arrived in San Francisco in March 1945, and the world felt alien to him. Everything was too clean, too safe, too normal. People complained about rationing and air raid drills, and Morrison wanted to scream at them. You don't know what real fear is. You haven't seen what's out there. But he kept his mouth shut. He'd signed papers. He'd given his word. He went to Chicago, found the girl he'd been writing to, and tried to build a life. They got married in 1946. Had kids. Morrison got a job at a factory, worked there for 30 years. He never talked about the war, never talked about what he'd seen. Stevens wrote to him a few times. The letters were guarded, careful, but Morrison could read between the lines. The attacks had continued after Morrison left. More men died. More snakes were killed. And then, in late 1945, something changed. The war ended, the troops came home, and the Solomon Islands were left to the locals. Whatever was happening there with the snakes, it became someone else's problem. Or maybe it just got buried, classified, locked away in some government archive where no one would ever find it. Chen died in 1953, cancer. Stevens in 1978, heart attack. Fletcher took his own life in 1950, never having recovered from what he'd seen. Morrison kept that piece of snake skin that Chen had cut off. He'd stolen it from Chen's effects after his friend died, felt bad about it, but justified it by telling himself he was preserving evidence. He kept it in a box in his basement, and sometimes, late at night, he'd take it out and look at it, and remember. Years passed. Decades. Morrison's wife died in 1990. His kids grew up, moved away, had families of their own. And Morrison, now an old man, found himself thinking more and more about that day in the jungle, about Duke, about the snakes, about all of it. He started doing research, what little he could. He went to libraries, looked up reports from the Solomon Islands during the war, tried to find any mention of what had happened. There was nothing. It was like those events had been erased from history. But in 1999, something changed. Morrison was in a veterans hospital, recovering from a stroke, when a young woman came to visit him. She said her name was Dr. Sarah Chen, and she was Chen's granddaughter. She was a biologist, specializing in reptiles, and she'd found something in her grandfather's papers. A journal. A detailed account of everything that had happened in the jungle, everything they'd seen. And she wanted to know if it was true. Morrison was 83 years old. He'd kept this secret for 54 years. He was tired. He was old. And he didn't see the point in lying anymore. So he told her yes. It was all true. Every word. And he showed her the snake skin, still preserved in that box, still showing those impossible scales. Dr. Chen ran tests on the skin. DNA analysis, carbon dating, everything modern science could throw at it. And what she found shocked both of them. The snake's DNA was wrong. It had markers that didn't exist in any known species. There were genetic sequences that looked artificial, engineered. Like something had been created in a laboratory, not evolved in nature. Dr. Chen suggested that maybe the Japanese had been conducting biological experiments during the war, trying to create weapons. Morrison didn't know. He just knew that what they'd encountered wasn't natural. And apparently, someone, somewhere, had known that all along. Dr. Chen wrote a paper about it, tried to get it published. Every journal rejected it. Too controversial. Not enough evidence. Impossible to verify. She tried to get the military to declassify the records from that time period. They claimed no such records existed. She tried to find other veterans who'd been there